She said it on a Tuesday evening, like it was a detail, not a turning point. She said, "I'm pregnant." Not whispered, not announced, just spoken, the way someone might say they forgot to buy milk. The dishwasher hummed in the background. The TV was tuned to the news, one of those talking heads arguing about something that wouldn't matter in a week. I remember nodding. I remember saying, okay. I don't remember standing up, hugging her, or even looking at her for more than a second. If I'm honest, I'm not sure I really heard her at all. That's the thing about moments that ruin or remake your life. They don't always arrive with drama. Sometimes they come quietly, and you're the one who fails to rise to meet them. At my age, you don't expect surprises like that. 52 years old. That number carries weight whether we admit it or not. At 52, you've already lived several lives. You've made mistakes you still don't talk about. You've survived things you thought would break you. You've learned which dreams to let go of and which routines keep the wheels turning. Pregnancy doesn't fit neatly into that picture. When you're young, a baby feels like the beginning of everything. When you're older, it feels like a question you didn't study for. I didn't say any of that out loud, of course. I didn't want to sound selfish or cruel. I told myself I was being calm, reasonable, mature. Inside, though, my mind was already racing ahead, doing math I hadn't planned on doing again. Years, money, energy, time, the kind of thoughts that don't leave much room for joy. She watched me carefully, the way people do when they're waiting for something important. A smile, a reaction, reassurance. I gave her none of those. Instead, I said something about dinner, asked if she was hungry. That was the first step backward, even though it didn't feel like movement at all. Silence doesn't always begin with the absence of words. Sometimes it starts with the wrong ones. Over the next few days, I noticed a shift, subtle enough that I could pretend it wasn't happening. She talked about the doctor, I talked about work. She mentioned feeling nauseous in the mornings. I joked about getting older and not sleeping well either. We were both speaking, but we weren't talking to each other anymore. We were talking around the thing that mattered most. I told myself I was giving her space, that she didn't need me hovering, that women had been doing this forever and she was strong enough to handle it. Those were comforting lies. The truth was simpler and uglier. I didn't know how to show up, and I was embarrassed by that fact. At my age, you're supposed to have answers. You're supposed to be the steady one. Admitting confusion felt like failure. So I leaned into what I knew. Routine. Distance. Keeping busy. I stayed later at work, not because I had to, but because it delayed going home. I scrolled through my phone longer, watched shows I didn't care about, fell asleep on the couch more often. None of it dramatic enough to start a fight, just enough to create space. And space, once it opens, doesn't close on its own. She didn't accuse me. That would have been easier. Accusations give you something to push against. Instead, she grew quieter, more observant. She started doing things on her own without asking if I wanted to come along. Grocery runs, walks, doctor appointments. I noticed, but I didn't comment. I told myself she preferred it that way. Here's something no one likes to admit. Sometimes we mistake someone's strength for permission to disappear. One evening, she asked me to come with her to an appointment. I said I couldn't get off work. That wasn't entirely true. I could have rearranged things, I just didn't want to. Sitting in a waiting room surrounded by expectant couples felt like standing in a mirror I wasn't ready to look into. She nodded when I told her, said, okay. There was that word again. It sounded different coming from her, less neutral, more final. If you've lived long enough, you know that tone. It's the sound people make when they stop asking. I didn't realize that at the time. I thought we were fine. No shouting, no tears, no slammed doors, just a calm, orderly life continuing as usual. That's what I told myself. But calm can be deceptive. There was a moment, weeks later, that should have shaken me awake. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom one night holding a small piece of paper, an ultrasound photo. I knew what it was before she said anything. "They let me take a copy," she said. I glanced at it from across the room. Gray shapes, indistinct lines. To me, it looked like static, like something from a broken television. "That's nice," I said, and went back to tying my shoes. I still see her face when I think about that moment. Not anger, not heartbreak, something quieter, something harder to fix. Disappointment mixed with understanding, as if she'd just confirmed a suspicion she'd been trying to ignore. She put the photo away without another word. Looking back now, I wish she had yelled. I wish she had thrown it at me or demanded I look. That kind of pain leaves marks you can see. This didn't. This settled into the walls, into the furniture, into the spaces between sentences. People think betrayal always looks like infidelity. A secret phone, a hidden relationship, a lie exposed. Sometimes betrayal is simply absence at the moment you're most needed. I didn't think of it that way then. I thought I was being practical, careful, measured. I underestimated what was happening in front of me because it didn't fit my expectations of crisis. And maybe that's the most dangerous thing of all, underestimating quiet moments. There was humor, too, in those early weeks, or at least attempts at it. She asked me one night to go to the store. Pickles, ice cream, peanut butter. I laughed and made some joke about stereotypes, about pregnancy cravings being predictable. She didn't laugh, just looked at me for a long second and said she'd go herself. It was a small thing, the kind of thing people forget. But small things accumulate. They stack up quietly like unpaid bills until one day you realize you're drowning and you can't remember when the water started rising. I noticed changes in her that I didn't comment on. She moved differently, slower, more careful. She slept with a hand resting on her stomach sometimes, even though it barely showed. I'd lie awake next to her and feel like a guest in my own bed. And instead of closing that distance, I accepted it. That's what I regret most now. Not the fear. Fear is human. It was the decision, made over and over again, to do nothing with it. I thought time would sort it out, that once the initial shock wore off, I'd feel differently, more excited, more connected. I assumed the feelings would arrive on their own. They rarely do. What I didn't know then was that something irreversible had already begun. Not just in her body, but in the way she saw me, in the way she adjusted her expectations. People don't always leave when they're hurt. Sometimes they stay and quietly rewrite the story they tell themselves about who you are. I was still convinced I had time. I didn't realize I was already running out. Time has a strange way of passing when you think you're standing still. Days kept moving forward, but inside that house, everything felt suspended, like we were both holding our breath without admitting it. Morning routine stayed the same. Coffee brewed, shoes by the door. The calendar on the wall quietly flipped pages, marking weeks I pretended not to count. She stopped inviting me into her inner world. At first, I didn't notice. Or maybe I noticed and chose to misunderstand it. She'd come back from appointments with fewer details. When I asked how things went, she'd say, "Fine," and leave it there. No descriptions, no worries, no excitement either. Fine is a dangerous word. It sounds complete, but it's usually anything but. I told myself she was tired. Hormones, stress. I'd heard all the explanations before, even if I'd never had to apply them this closely. It was easy to intellectualize what was happening, much harder to sit with the idea that my absence had taught her something important, that she couldn't rely on me the way she thought she could. There's a quiet kind of betrayal, that doesn't feel like betrayal when you're the one committing it. It feels like self-preservation. I was protecting myself from feeling inadequate, from feeling old, from feeling like I'd missed the window where this sort of thing made sense. I didn't want to say any of that out loud, because once spoken, it becomes real. So I kept it inside, and distance did the speaking for me. One evening, she rearranged the living room. I came home and noticed the couch had been moved, a small bookshelf shifted closer to the window. It was subtle, but I knew the space well enough to feel the difference immediately. "Looks nice," I said. "Thought it would make more room." "For what?" She paused, just briefly. "For later." Later. That word landed heavier than it should have. It was a future I wasn't sure I wanted to picture, let alone prepare for. I nodded, like I always did, and went to wash my hands. Practical, neutral, safe. What I didn't see then was that she wasn't just rearranging furniture, she was rearranging her expectations, making space in her life for something new, something that increasingly did not include my emotional presence. People talk about being underestimated like it's always an insult, like it's something done to you. But sometimes you're the one doing the underestimating, and you don't realize it until it's too late. I underestimated how closely she was watching. I underestimated how much my silence was saying. I underestimated how quickly a person can adapt when they realize they're essentially on their own. There was a morning when she left early, before I woke up. That didn't used to happen. She'd always make noise on purpose, just enough to wake me, just to say goodbye. That morning, the house was quiet when I opened my eyes. No note, no text. I checked my phone, half expecting a message. Nothing. At work, I caught myself thinking about it more than I wanted to admit. I told myself she was tired. Hormones, stress. I'd heard all the explanations before, even if I'd never had to apply them this closely. It was easy to intellectualize what was happening, much harder to sit with the idea that my absence had taught her something important, that she couldn't rely on me the way she thought she could. When I got home that evening, she was already there, sitting at the table with papers spread out in front of her, pamphlets, forms, a notebook filled with handwriting I didn't recognize as well as I used to. "What's all this?" I asked. "Just stuff," she said. That answer irritated me more than it should have. I felt excluded, and instead of recognizing that feeling for what it was, I turned it into annoyance. "You don't have to shut me out," I said, sharper than intended. She looked up slowly, really looked at me. Then she said something that still echoes in my head. "I didn't think you wanted to be involved." I opened my mouth to argue, to explain, to say that wasn't true, but the words got stuck, because if I was honest, I wasn't sure she was wrong. Silence followed. Thick, uncomfortable silence, the kind that makes you aware of every sound in the room, the clock ticking, the refrigerator humming, the space between breaths. She gathered the papers and stacked them neatly. "I'm just trying to be prepared," she said. "I can't afford not to be." That sentence wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact, and facts don't care about intentions. That night, I lay awake thinking about how things had shifted without my permission, how the role I thought I occupied was being quietly reassigned. I felt underestimated, strangely enough, even though I was the one who had stepped back. That's the irony of emotional distance. You create it, and then you resent it when it grows. I started noticing other changes. She laughed less around me, or maybe she laughed just as much, just not where I could hear it. She took phone calls in the other room, texted more, smiled at her screen sometimes, and instead of curiosity, I felt a dull, irrational jealousy. Not because I thought she was betraying me in the way people usually mean that word, but because she was forming a world I wasn't at the center of anymore. There was humor in that if I'd been able to see it, Me, at my age, feeling sidelined like an insecure teenager. Life has a way of humbling you when you least expect it. One afternoon, she asked me what I thought about names. Names for what? I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. She raised an eyebrow. You're kidding, right? I shrugged. I hadn't really thought about it. That was the truth, and it sounded worse out loud than it did in my head. She stared at me for a moment, then laughed, a short, humorless laugh. Of course you haven't. That was the first time I felt it clearly, the beginning of her disappointment turning into something else. Not anger, not sadness, resolve. Resolve is quiet, and it's dangerous to underestimate. From that point on, she stopped asking. She made decisions and informed me afterward, if at all. Doctor, budget, plans. She wasn't being cruel, she was being efficient. I told myself she was taking control, that this was a good thing, that she didn't need me for every detail. But deep down, something uneasy started to grow. Because I could feel it happening. I was becoming optional. And still, I did nothing to stop it. That's what haunts me now. Not a single big mistake, just a series of small retreats. A belief that I could step back in whenever I was ready. I didn't understand then that people don't wait forever, especially when something bigger than both of you is on the way. The shock, when it finally came, didn't arrive all at once. It crept closer, quietly, disguised as normalcy. And by the time I recognized it for what it had already passed through the door and taken a seat. I just didn't know it yet. There's a moment when silence stops being something you notice and starts being something you live inside. I woke up one morning and realized I couldn't remember the last real conversation we'd had. Not an exchange of information, not logistics, a conversation. The kind where you lose track of time and forget what you were originally talking about because you're too busy listening. That realization sat heavy in my chest all day. I tried, awkwardly, to reinsert myself, asked how she was feeling, asked if there was anything she needed. The questions came out stiff, like lines from a script I hadn't rehearsed enough. "I'm fine," she said. There it was again. Fine. She said it kindly. That somehow made it worse. I told myself it was too late in the day to start something meaningful. I'd try tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week. Next week became another stretch of quiet coexistence. At some point, you stop calling it distance and start calling it normal. She was showing now, not dramatically, but enough that strangers noticed. Cashiers smiled at her, people held doors open, offered help. I watched those interactions from a few steps behind, feeling strangely invisible. It was unsettling to realize the world was responding to her in ways I wasn't. There was a small moment of humor at the grocery store one afternoon. A teenage cashier looked at me, then at her belly, then back at me. "Congratulations," he said, beaming. "Thanks," I replied, automatically. Then he added, "Grandpa must be proud." I laughed. She didn't. The kid's face turned red. He stammered an apology. I waved it off, still chuckling, but when we got to the car, she was quiet. "That didn't bother you?" she asked. I shrugged. Why would it? She didn't answer, just buckled her seatbelt and stared out the window. It bothered her, and it should have bothered me. But I'd already started detaching from the emotional weight of things like that. Humor had become my shield. If I could laugh it off, I didn't have to feel it. She, on the other hand, was feeling everything. At home, she'd sit with her hands on her stomach, eyes closed, breathing slowly. I didn't ask what she was thinking about. I was afraid of the answer. One evening, she mentioned a class, something about breathing techniques, preparation for labor. She asked if I wanted to come. "I'll think about it," I said. That's another dangerous phrase. It sounds considerate. It buys you time. Most of the time, it means no. She nodded. No argument, no persuasion. Later that night, I heard her on the phone in the other room, laughing softly. It wasn't the laugh she used with me anymore. It was lighter, freer. I caught myself standing still in the hallway, listening, feeling like an intruder in my own house. That was new, and it scared me. People don't realize how easy it is to be slowly replaced. Not by another person, necessarily. Sometimes you're replaced by a version of independence the other person never wanted to develop, but had to. She stopped waiting for me to be ready. I told myself this was temporary, that once the baby arrived, things would shift, I'd step up, instinct would kick in. That's what people say, right? That something changes when the child is born. It was comforting to believe that. Meanwhile, she was already changing. There was a night when the power went out during a storm. The house went dark, the wind howled. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight, fumbling like a teenager who couldn't find his way in his own home. She laughed then. A real laugh. "You always forget where the candles are," she said. She walked straight to the hall closet, grabbed one, and lit it with a match she'd tucked away. The room filled with warm light. In that moment, I saw her differently. Calm, capable, grounded. And for a split second, I felt proud. Then the pride twisted into something else. Fear. Because she didn't need me to steady her. She had already learned how to steady herself. That's the part people don't talk about when they talk about strength. Strength grows in the absence of support, and once it's there, it doesn't disappear just because you decide you're ready to participate again. I tried to assert myself in small ways, gave unsolicited advice, commented on things I'd ignored for months. She listened politely, then did what she'd already planned to do. That hurt more than I expected. I started feeling underestimated, like my opinions didn't carry weight anymore, like I'd been demoted without being told. What I couldn't admit was that I'd done that to myself. There was a conversation one night that almost became an argument. Almost. "I feel like you don't care," she said, quietly, not looking at me. "I do care," I replied immediately, too quickly. "Then why does it feel like I'm doing this alone?" That question hung in the air between us, heavy, unavoidable. I searched for an answer that wouldn't make me sound weak or selfish or afraid. I found none. "I don't know," I finally said. She nodded as if she'd expected that. "I figured." She went to bed early that night. I stayed up, staring at the dark television screen, my own reflection faintly visible. I looked older than I felt, or maybe I felt older than I wanted to admit. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from sharing a space with someone who has emotionally moved on. You're not alone, but you're not together either. You exist in parallel, occasionally intersecting, never quite touching. That was our life now. And still, I underestimated how close we were to the breaking point. I thought this was just a phase, a rough stretch, something we'd look back on and shake our heads about. I didn't see the shock coming, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive. It was quiet, calculated, and devastating. And it was already taking shape while I was busy convincing myself everything could still be fixed later. The first real shock didn't arrive as a confrontation. It arrived as organization. One evening, I came home to find labeled folders spread across the dining table, color-coded, neat. A stack of envelopes sat off to the side, addressed in her handwriting. "What's all this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Paperwork," she said, "just getting things in order." That phrase should have stopped me cold. Getting things in order is what people do when they're preparing for change. Big change. The kind that doesn't assume everyone is coming along for the ride. I picked up one of the folders. Insurance. Another one, savings. Another, contacts. My name appeared occasionally, but not often, and when it did, it was written carefully, like a formality. You planning something I should know about? I joked. She didn't smile. I'm planning for reality, she said. That's all. That was the moment it hit me. She wasn't organizing our life, she was organizing hers. I felt a flicker of panic then, sharp and unexpected. It felt unfair almost, like she was moving ahead without warning. But the truth, the uncomfortable truth, was that she'd been warning me for months, just not in words. Silence had been her language. I just hadn't bothered to learn it. I tried to reassert myself that night, asked questions, offered suggestions, pointed out things she might have missed. She listened patiently, nodded, thanked me, and kept doing what she was doing. That's when I realized something had shifted permanently. My input was no longer required for her sense of stability. She had built a system that functioned without my emotional involvement. People talk about feeling betrayed when someone pulls away, but betrayal, I learned, can go both ways. She felt abandoned. I felt replaced. Neither of us said those words. Instead, we talked about weather, about errands, about nothing at all. There was a strange, almost dark humor to it. Two grown adults tiptoeing around the obvious like it was a loose floorboard we might fall through if we stepped too hard. One morning, she announced she'd found a pediatrician. "Oh," I said, "already?" "Yes," she replied. "I didn't want to wait." "Wait for what?" I asked before I could stop myself. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and said, "For you to be ready." That stung, more than I expected. I wanted to argue that I was ready, that I just needed time. But the truth is, readiness isn't something you claim after the fact, it's something you demonstrate while it matters. And I hadn't. From that point on, something inside me shifted from denial to resentment. Not the explosive kind, the quiet, simmering kind that makes you interpret everything as a slight. I noticed how confidently she moved through the house, how she made plans without checking with me, how she spoke about the future using I instead of we. Each time, it felt like a small cut. At the same time, I couldn't ignore a growing, reluctant admiration. She was handling things, thriving even. There was a steadiness to her now that hadn't been there before. I had underestimated her. I'd thought she'd crumble without support, thought she'd need reassurance, guidance, constant presence. Instead, she adapted, she learned, she adjusted. And in doing so, she became someone I wasn't sure how to fit alongside anymore. There was a moment of awkward humor during dinner one night. She was reading a book about early childhood development, highlighter in hand. "You studying for finals?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Something like that." "For a degree I didn't know you were pursuing?" I added. She closed the book gently. "I'm studying for responsibility." That ended the jokes. Later that night, I tried to apologize. Not fully, not clearly, just enough to test the waters. "I know I haven't been as present," I said. She waited. "I just needed some time to adjust." She nodded slowly. "I gave you time." There was no anger in her voice, just certainty. That scared me more than shouting ever could, because certainty means decisions have already been made. From then on, I started noticing the emotional math she was doing. Who to call when she needed advice, who to lean on when she felt overwhelmed. Friends, family, people who showed up without hesitation. My role was becoming peripheral. And the worst part? I couldn't even blame her. I'd taught her how to live without me. That realization hit hard, but still not hard enough to force real change. I told myself I'd step in soon, that I just needed the right moment. The right moment is another lie people tell themselves. There was an evening when she came home excited about something. I could hear it in her voice before I even saw her. "The baby kicked today," she said. "Oh," I replied, distracted, checking my phone. "That's good." She stood there for a few seconds longer, waiting for more. "Do you want to feel?" she asked. I hesitated, just for a second, but she noticed. "It's okay," she said quickly. "Another time." She went to the bedroom and closed the door. I sat there, phone in hand, staring at a screen that suddenly felt meaningless. That was the night I realized I was missing things I would never get back. But even then, I didn't understand the full cost. The late shock was still coming. And when it arrived, it would make all this quiet distance feel merciful by comparison. The house began to feel like a place I passed through rather than lived in. My things were still there, my shoes by the door, my mug in the cabinet, but something essential had shifted, like a picture knocked slightly crooked on the wall. You don't notice it at first, but once you do, you can't stop seeing it. She had developed a rhythm that didn't include me. Morning walks, afternoon calls, evening routines I wasn't part of. Not intentionally shut out, just not invited in. I tried to convince myself this was what independence looked like. Healthy, modern, two adults coexisting. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This wasn't partnership, this was parallel living. There was a Sunday afternoon when I suggested we go out to eat, something casual, no planning required. "I already ate," she said. It was barely 2 in the afternoon. "With who?" I asked, half joking. "With myself," she replied. "I was hungry." That answer lingered, not because it was wrong, but because it revealed how much she'd stopped waiting for me. Waiting is an act of faith, and faith, once broken, doesn't restore itself easily. I began noticing how often she said, "I've got it," before I could even offer help. Groceries, appointments, decisions. Each time, it felt like another small door closing. At first, I told myself I didn't mind, that I enjoyed the freedom, that less responsibility meant less pressure. But freedom loses its appeal when it starts feeling like irrelevance. There was a moment of unintended humor that almost made me laugh out loud. She was assembling something, some kind of crib component on the living room floor. Instructions spread out, pieces neatly organized. "Need help?" I asked. She looked up, considered it, then said, "No, I'm good." 10 minutes later, I watched her lift the partially assembled frame and rotate it effortlessly. "Looks like you could have used me," I muttered, trying to sound playful. She smiled. "I figured it out." That smile wasn't dismissive. It was confident, and it made me feel smaller than I expected. I started feeling like an extra in a life I'd once believed was shared. I'd come into runes mid-conversation, mid-thought, mid-laughter, and leave without understanding what I'd interrupted. At night, I lay awake listening to her breathe, wondering when exactly she'd stopped needing me, and whether I'd notice when she stopped wanting me. The answer, it turned out, was already unfolding. There was a conversation I hadn't planned on having. It happened in the car, of all places. Traffic heavy, radio low, nowhere to escape. "I'm going to stay with my sister for a while," she said, eyes fixed on the road. "For how long?" I asked. "I don't know." That was the late shock I hadn't expected to come so soon. "Why?" I asked, though the answer was painfully obvious. "I need support," she said, "and consistency." The way she said it, calm, measured, made it clear this wasn't a threat. It wasn't a dramatic exit. It was a logistical decision. Those are the ones that hurt the most. I wanted to argue, to promise things would be different, to insist I could step up, but the words felt flimsy, even to me. She glanced at me briefly. "I'm not doing this to punish you," she said. "I'm doing it to protect myself." And the baby, she didn't have to add. That night, I helped her pack. Or rather, I stood nearby while she packed, handed her things when she asked, watched pieces of her life disappear into suitcases. There was no shouting, no tears, just quiet efficiency. At one point, I tried to lighten the mood, made a joke about how the house would be too quiet without her. She didn't laugh. "It's already been quiet," she said. That landed hard. When she left the next morning, the house felt cavernous, empty in a way I hadn't anticipated. I walked from room to room, noticing what was missing, the sound of her moving around, the energy she brought with her. That was when the full weight of what I'd done, or failed to do, settled in. I'd mistaken her silence for patience, her independence for permanence, her strength for invulnerability. I'd underestimated her capacity to adapt, to survive, to choose herself. And now, I was alone with the echo of my own inaction. I told myself this was temporary, that she just needed space, that she'd come back once things calmed down. People tell themselves many things when reality becomes inconvenient. What I didn't know was that something irreversible had already happened inside her, something that didn't require my understanding or approval. The real shock was still ahead. And when it came, it would arrive not as an argument, but as a revelation. The days after she left blurred together in a way that made time feel unreliable. Morning came whether I was ready or not. Coffee tasted the same. The news droned on. But the house had lost its center of gravity. Sounds echoed longer. Lights stayed off longer. I found myself standing in rooms without remembering why I'd gone there. I told people she was visiting family. That much was true. What I didn't say was how quiet it felt, or how the quiet seemed to watch me. At first, I expected relief, space, time to think. Isn't that what I'd wanted all along? Instead, I felt exposed. There was no one to hide from anymore, no one whose presence distracted me from my own thoughts. Every avoidance I'd practiced now had nowhere to go. I started replaying moments I'd dismissed at the time. The ultrasound photo, the appointment I skipped, the hesitation before touching her stomach. They came back with sharp clarity, like scenes from a movie I could no longer pause. I called her on the third day. "How are you?" I asked. "Okay," she said. That word again. "Are you settled?" I continued. "Yes." A pause followed, not awkward, just complete. "I miss you," I said, surprising myself. "I know," she replied. There was no warmth in that response, no invitation, just acknowledgement. We ended the call politely, cordially, like two people who used to know each other well and were trying not to say the wrong thing. That's when it hit me. She wasn't angry. Anger would have meant hope. What she felt was something else, something calmer, something resolved. I tried to make changes, real ones this time, cleaned the house thoroughly, bought things I thought might help, read articles, watched videos, took notes like I was studying for an exam I'd already failed once. I told myself I was preparing to be better, to show her I could do this. But preparation without presence is just theory. When I visited her at her sister's place, I brought groceries, healthy ones, thoughtful ones. I even remembered the brand she liked. She thanked me, accepted them, set them aside. We sat at the kitchen table, making small talk. Her sister moved around us, filling the space with noise and kindness I hadn't provided when it mattered. She looked good, calmer, supported. That should have comforted me. Instead, it scared me because she didn't look like someone waiting to be rescued. She looked like someone who had already been saved by herself. There was a moment during that visit when I reached for her hand, just instinctively. She didn't pull away. She didn't squeeze back either. Neutral. That neutrality told me more than words ever could. I tried to apologize. A real apology this time. No explanations, no excuses. I should have been there, I said. I wasn't. I see that now. She listened, then nodded. I believe you. Those 3 words gave me hope. Then she added, I just don't know what to do with that now. Hope vanished. Because regret, no matter how sincere, doesn't rewind time. Driving home that night, I laughed once, out loud, at myself. All those months I'd worried about being underestimated, about losing relevance, about being unnecessary. I'd done a remarkable job of making those fears come true. There's a cruel humor in that, if you let yourself see it. Weeks passed. I attended appointments alone, sat in waiting rooms filled with couples and families, feeling like I'd wandered into the wrong movie. I learned things too late, important things, names, measurements, dates. Each new detail felt like a reminder of how much I'd missed. When she went into the later stages of pregnancy, something shifted again. Not toward me, away from uncertainty. She spoke with confidence now, asked fewer questions, trusted her instincts. I realized then that the baby had already changed her, had already given her something solid to lean into, and I was still standing on hesitation. One afternoon, she called me unexpectedly. They say the baby's healthy, she said. That's great, I replied, relief flooding my voice. I wanted you to know it. I thought you should hear it from me. Thank you, I said. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, phone in hand, feeling both grateful and deeply sad. Because being informed is not the same as being included. I started to understand that the late shock wasn't going to be a single moment. It was a process, a slow dawning realization that the version of the future I'd assumed would be there might no longer exist, that the place I thought I could step back into might not be waiting. And that realization hurt more than anything I'd experienced so far. The closer she got to her due date, the more I felt like a distant relative instead of a partner. Updates came, but they were measured, carefully portioned. Enough to inform, not enough to invite. I knew when appointments were scheduled, but not always when they happened. I knew the general plan, but not the details. Details are where intimacy lives. I told myself this was fair, that I had earned this distance. Accountability sounds noble when you say it out loud, but living inside it is another thing entirely. There was a night when the phone rang late. Too late for casual conversation. My heart jumped before I even picked it up. It's not time, she said quickly, almost amused by my silence. Relax. I laughed, shaky. You can't blame me. I'm just calling because I need you to listen, she said. That caught my attention. She talked for a while, about fears she hadn't shared before, about pain, about uncertainty. I didn't interrupt. I didn't fix. I just listened. When she finished, there was a pause. Thank you, she said. That helped. That word again. Helped. It felt good and dangerous. Because for a moment, I thought this meant things were turning around, that I was being let back in. But the next day, the distance returned. Polite, structured, intentional. I realized then that one good moment doesn't undo months of absence. Trust isn't restored in bursts. It's rebuilt in consistency. Consistency I hadn't shown. There was an odd, almost bitter humor in how people treated me once they found out. Friends would ask how excited I was. Coworkers would clap me on the back, joke about sleepless nights and diapers. I smiled, nodded, played the role. Inside, I felt like an imposter. I hadn't earned that celebration. Not yet. Maybe not ever. When the doctor suggested a birth plan meeting, I asked if I should attend. She hesitated, just long enough to be honest. It might be easier if you don't, she said. Easier. Not better, not kinder, easier. That word told me everything I needed to know about where I stood. I agreed. What else could I do? That night, I sat alone in the house and tried to imagine the moment she'd go into labor. Who would be there? Who would hold her hand? Who would speak for her when she was exhausted and afraid? I wasn't sure if I was on that list. That uncertainty was the sharpest pain of all. There was a memory that kept resurfacing. The first time she'd told me she was pregnant. The way I'd nodded, said, okay, changed the subject. I replayed it over and over, wondering how different things might have been if I'd reacted differently. If I'd stood up, hugged her, let myself feel whatever came next instead of retreating. You can't rewrite moments like that. They set a tone that echoes far longer than you expect. A week before her due date, she came by the house to pick up some things, baby items she'd left behind. I watched her move through the space like a visitor, purposeful, detached. She paused in the doorway of what had once been our shared bedroom. I might not come back here for a while, she said. I nodded, throat tight. I understand. She turned to leave, then stopped. You know, she said, not unkindly, I never thought I could do this alone. That sentence hung there, unfinished. And now? I asked. Now I know I can, she said. That was the late shock. Not that she might leave, not that she'd grown independent, but that she had crossed a threshold without me, and there was no guarantee I could follow. After she left, I sat on the edge of the bed and laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because sometimes laughter is the only sound that fits when you realize you're facing the consequences of your own silence. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't defensive. I was just aware. Aware that underestimation cuts both ways. I had underestimated her strength, and she had finally stopped overestimating my presence. The phone could ring at any moment now. The call I both feared and hoped for. And when it came, it would decide more than just where I stood that day. It would decide who I was allowed to be going forward. The call came early in the morning when the sky was still deciding whether it wanted to be light. I knew before I answered. The body knows things the mind hasn't caught up to yet. It's time, she said. 2 words. No panic, no rush, just fact. I'm on my way, I replied, already moving. I don't remember the drive. I remember stopping at a red light and realizing my hands were shaking. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should have filled the gas tank the night before. When I arrived at the hospital, her sister met me in the hallway. She nodded once, like we were co-workers about to start a shift. She's doing okay, she said. They're getting her settled. I waited, sat, stood, sat again. When I was finally allowed into the room, the energy hit me immediately. Focused, intense. Not chaotic, but serious. This was happening with or without my emotional readiness. She looked at me when I entered, not relieved, not upset, just aware. You made it, she said. Of course, I answered, though something about that word felt fragile. I stayed near the wall, unsure where to place myself. Her sister handled most of the communication with the nurses. They deferred to her instinctively. She knew what was needed. I realized then how completely I'd been replaced in that role. There was a strange, almost uncomfortable humor in it. I had worried so much about not knowing what to do, and here I was, living that exact fear. Hours passed. At some point, she reached for my hand, just briefly, not to hold it, to ground herself. I froze, then held on. It was the most connected we'd been in months. Then it was over. A nurse said something. A cry cut through the room. Sharp, alive, unmistakable. The baby arrived into a world already shaped by our choices. I stood there, stunned, as they placed the child on her chest. Her face changed in an instant. Something settled, something fierce and protective. She cried, quietly, relieved, whole. I felt joy, awe, and a deep, sinking awareness. I was witnessing something I had not earned. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were softer than they'd been in a long time. "Meet your child," she said. I stepped forward, heart pounding, and looked down. Life. Real life. Fragile and demanding and undeniable. In that moment, the late shock fully landed. Not because of the baby, because of what it took for me to arrive there at all. Afterward, as things calmed down, her sister left the room. The door closed quietly. She looked at me then, really looked at me. "I need you to understand something," she said. I nodded. "I didn't do this alone to prove a point," she continued. "I did it because I had to." "I know," I said. "I'm not angry," she added, "but things can't go back to how they were." That sentence settled heavily between us. "I'm not asking you to disappear," she said, "but I'm also not pretending everything's fine." Honesty, at last. Clean, clear, painful. I wanted to promise change, to swear I'd be better, to reclaim something. Instead, I said the only thing that felt true. "I'll do the work," I said, "whatever that means." She studied me for a long moment. "We'll see," she replied. That was fair. Later, alone in the hallway, I leaned against the wall and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for months. I wasn't shut out, but I wasn't in. I was standing in between, at a doorway I'd once walked away from without realizing it. The late shock wasn't a single blow. It was the understanding that some doors don't reopen fully, no matter how sincere your knock is, and that whatever came next would require more than words. The days after the birth felt unreal, like I was moving through someone else's life. There were visiting hours, rules, schedules. I learned quickly that everything now revolved around the baby's needs, and rightly so. I hovered, unsure when to step in and when to step back. I'd already learned the cost of guessing wrong. She watched me carefully, not suspiciously, evaluatively. That was new. I changed diapers under supervision, held the baby with exaggerated caution, like one wrong move would shatter something sacred. Her sister offered advice gently. Nurses corrected me kindly. I thanked everyone too much. There was an odd, almost bitter humor in how natural it all felt to everyone else. They seemed to slip into their roles with ease. I felt like I was auditioning for a part that might not be offered to me again. When we finally left the hospital, she didn't come home with me. She went back to her sister's place. That choice was practical, sensible, and devastating. I followed in my car, watching from a distance as she was helped inside. I didn't carry the baby in. I didn't unpack bags. I stood on the porch and said goodnight. The door closed softly. No argument, no finality, just reality. At home, the silence returned, but this time it was heavier, weighted by missed moments and second chances I wasn't sure I deserved. I tried to be useful, Sent messages asking if they needed anything, dropped off supplies, offered to take night shifts. Sometimes she accepted, sometimes she didn't. Each decision felt like a verdict. There was a night, about a week in, when she called me unexpectedly. "Can you come over?" she asked. I was out the door before she finished the sentence. When I arrived, she looked exhausted, the kind of tired that settles into your bones. "I just need an hour," she said, "to sleep." I nodded, took the baby gently, sat in the rocking chair, heart pounding, afraid to blink. In that quiet hour, something shifted. Holding that child, feeling the weight, the warmth, the trust, it stripped away every excuse I'd ever used. There was no room for hesitation there, no room for ego, just responsibility. When she woke up and saw us, her expression softened. "Thank you," she said. Not as politeness, as acknowledgement. That mattered more than she knew. But one good hour doesn't erase months of distance. We talked more in those early weeks, but carefully. Honestly, but not optimistically. She was clear about her boundaries, about what she expected, about what she would no longer accept. I listened. Really listened. That was new, too. There was a conversation one afternoon that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. "I don't know what this looks like long term," she said. "I just know it can't look like before." I nodded. "I understand. And I need you to understand something else," she continued. "I don't need promises. I need patterns." Patterns. Consistency. Presence. Words I'd once dismissed as abstract suddenly felt concrete. She wasn't asking for perfection. She was asking for proof. I started showing up without being asked. Not dramatically, just reliably. Same times, same effort, no excuses. Some days she let me in a little more, other days she didn't. I learned not to take that personally. Trust, once fractured, doesn't rebuild on a schedule. There was a moment of quiet humor one evening when the baby wouldn't stop crying. "I think it's you," she said dryly. "You might have that effect." I laughed. So did she. That laugh felt like a small bridge. Fragile, but real. I didn't know where it would lead. I still don't. But for the first time, I wasn't pulling away. I was standing still, letting responsibility meet me where I was. And that, I realized, was the only place rebuilding could begin. Time doesn't fix things on its own. It just gives you opportunities to prove whether you've learned anything. Weeks turned into months, slowly, uneventfully, which, I learned, was a good sign. Drama had burned us before. What we needed now was steadiness. I showed up. Not loudly, not heroically. I showed up the same way every time. Same days, same tone, same willingness. I stopped waiting to be invited into responsibility and started assuming it, quietly, respectfully. Some days she watched me like she was still deciding. Other days she moved aside without comment and let me step in. Both felt earned. We didn't talk much about the past, not because it didn't matter, but because we both understood it too well. The past had taught us enough. Repeating it wouldn't change it. Instead, we talked about now. Feeding schedules, doctor visits, sleepless nights, the unglamorous details of care. There was something humbling about it, something grounding. I learned how much I'd underestimated silence, how destructive my absence had been, even when it was quiet, even when it seemed harmless. And I learned something harder. Silence isn't neutral. It's a choice. There was a day when she looked at me across the room, the baby asleep in her arms, and said, "You're different." I didn't smile. I didn't argue. I had to be, I replied. She nodded. That was enough. We never went back to the way things were. That life was gone. And maybe that was the mercy in it. Because the version of me that existed then couldn't handle what this required. The shock I'd feared, the one I thought would destroy me, didn't. It clarified me. I understood now that betrayal doesn't always come from what you do wrong. Sometimes it comes from what you failed to do at all. I'd betrayed the moment she needed me most by pulling away, by underestimating her, by assuming time would wait. Time never does. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone listening to this, especially those who think they've already lived their biggest moments, it's this. Don't confuse calm with safety. Don't confuse silence with patience. And don't assume the people you love will wait for you to be ready. They will adapt. They will grow. And if you're not careful, they will grow past you. She didn't punish me. She didn't threaten me. She simply chose herself when I wouldn't choose us. That was the late shock. And the lesson stayed. I'm still learning, still proving, still showing up. Not because I'm afraid of losing her again, but because presence, I finally understand, is the only real form of love that lasts.